Hello, I'm David Griffin, and I'm going to give an overview of my work on using Novelty Search to debug physical system simulations, which was conducted as part of the March project between the University of York and the University of Sheffield. To start with, I'll introduce standard optimizing searches. These are methods which attempt to find an optimal solution to a given problem. In this case, optimality is normally defined via a metric function of some description, which describes how well a candidate solution does. This could be characterized in different ways depending on the problem. It could be a cost to minimize or a score to maximize. Optimizing search is a well-studied problem with lots of different methods available as generic solutions, such as hill climbing, simulated annealing, or genetic algorithms. However, optimizing search comes with some inherent problems that make it difficult to use in some situations. One of the most studied is local versus global optima. An example of this is if you're using hill climbing, there's no guarantee that the hill the algorithm climbed is the tallest hill in the entire landscape of the problem. Being able to break out of local optima is one of the main ways in which different optimizing search algorithms seek to differentiate themselves from each other. There are also other more fundamental problems for optimizing search. One of these is that optimizing search does assume the user can define a criteria to describe what is optimal. It may be that the user does not know how to define what is optimal for a given problem. This could come around due to the problem being non-specific, where multiple solutions with different properties may be required for different variants of the problem. Alternatively, it could also come about by having multiple metrics which are difficult to combine. For example, the previous slide gave cost and score as potential metrics, but a user might want to be able to consider both of these when searching without necessarily combining them in an arbitrary way like cost per unit score. This is where novelty search comes in as a solution. Novelty search allows a user to define a behavior space by specifying metrics that describe the behavior of individual candidate solutions. Novelty search then attempts to provide coverage of the reachable areas of the behavior space. In so doing, novelty search will identify solutions that have unusual or novel behaviors. Multiple methods to accomplish this are available. This talk uses the pie chart framework with a microbial GA to explore the behavior space. Having introduced novelty search, I'll now move on to the other major topic of this talk, debugging. Debugging is something that almost every person who writes software will have experience of. It's rare for programs to work first time, and so it's necessary to debug them. Software bugs can be thought of as behavior which is unintended, unexpected, and incorrect. As software gets more complex, the amount of effort involved in debugging also increases because there are more places in which things can go wrong. This has led to a large number of approaches in finding software bugs. Some examples of these are as follows. Software can be compared against an oracle, a source of correct answers, which is somehow inappropriate to use in practice. For example, the oracle could be too slow, or perhaps it might not even be software at all, but a person who just gives the correct answer to any given query. Software can also be unit tested, which compares the outcome in a specific set of circumstances against an expected outcome. Another technique is fuzzing, where randomized inputs are used to try and break the program, typically by causing it to crash, although outputs could be compared against some limited hypotheses as well, such as outputs always being well formatted, providing the input is valid. For experimental simulators, such as the one that is the test subject in this talk, the typical debug workflow is as follows. The simulator is first developed, and then subjected to a battery of tests. If a bug is found, further development is needed to remedy the issues. Otherwise, the simulator can be deemed ready and used in experiments, or at least until a new bug is found after deployment. Now that novelty search and debugging have been introduced, I can get back to the research. The initial idea for the research came from two definitions. Firstly, that software bugs are unintended, unexpected, and incorrect behavior that substantial effort is put into finding and removing. And secondly, that novel behavior, of the type that novelty search seeks to find, includes unexpected behavior. The corollary of these definitions is that it is possible to use novelty search to find unexpected behaviors that may correspond to software bugs. As this process can be largely automated, there is the potential to make it easier to find software bugs. This leads to the subject of this talk, DebugNS, an application of novelty search to debugging. DebugNS replaces the standard metrics used in novelty search with tests or testable hypotheses. It then uses novelty search to find where these tests or hypotheses yield the most novel behaviors. If software is bug-free, then the expected result of DebugNS is that we limited novel behaviors to discover. However, if DebugNS is able to find novel behaviors which break the user's hypotheses on how the software should behave, then these likely correspond to bugs. Specifically, either a bug in the software, a bug in the test, or a misunderstanding of the capabilities of the system. It's also worth noting that if the user is already intending to use novelty search, for example to explore the behavior of a simulated system, such as we were doing in the March project, then using novelty search for debugging purposes is almost free to implement. Most of the hard work will already be done as part of the integration of novelty search. This slide shows the DebugNS workflow. There are a lot of similarities to the standard debugging workflow presented earlier. Firstly, a simulator is developed, and then it is subjected to DebugNS with some hypotheses given by the user. Unlike standard testing, DebugNS only requires these hypotheses and metrics. If analysis of the individuals found by DebugNS is inconsistent with the user's hypothesis, then the simulator must return to development, which may include refining the hypotheses if these are the parts which are wrong, or correcting bugs in the simulator. On the other hand, if the individuals found by DebugNS are consistent with the user's hypotheses, then the simulator can be cleared to be used in experiments. In this case, using novelty search to explore for interesting behaviors with a different set of metrics. As mentioned before, DebugNS requires metrics to define a behavior space to explore. The first method to supply DebugNS with metrics is to adapt traditional tests for use in DebugNS. Not all tests are appropriate. In general, DebugNS will perform best if the tests are not simply binary. Novelty search wants more information than a simple "did it crash" or "it got the right answer." Hence, it's useful to convert tests that check for a specific answer into ones that just return the values without checking them. Testing the correctness of results can be carried out after the novelty search has run. If novelty search is unable to find unusual behaviors, then it will present a wide variety of broadly similar individuals. But if it is able to find unusual behaviors, there will be varied individuals that demonstrate these unusual behaviors. Regardless of what novelty search returned, all of the individuals can then be checked for correctness afterwards. As to what tests should be carried out in this manner, the criteria are similar to any other form of tests. You want to stress the system, exercising both expected and corner cases. It's also possible to use more abstract hypotheses for DebugNS metrics than are typically found in tests. This involves applying some processing to the output of individuals found using novelty search and comparing against some hypothesis. For example, the user might specify that individuals present no more than 5 types of output, but not know exactly what those types are, just how to identify them. Any individuals found that break the hypotheses can then be flagged to the user for investigation. Compared to metrics derived from tests, working from more abstract hypotheses, it's easier to expose more types of input to the novelty search, allowing for more of the behavior space to be examined. To test using DebugNS, we applied it to a nanoscale magnetic ring array simulator, RingSim. RingSim is used to explore the behaviors of magnetic ring arrays and evaluate their effectiveness for reservoir computing. RingSim simulates the progression of domain walls within the magnetic ring array, and these domain walls move by some relatively simple rules. For example, they normally follow an external magnetic field that drives them, but can get stuck at junctions between rings. If a domain wall gets stuck for too long, it can be annihilated should another domain wall touch it. And if a domain wall moves past an empty ring, it can spawn new domain walls in that ring. During the development of RingSim, there was a need to refactor the simulator, for the normal reasons of needing to make it run faster and improving code reuse. While this refactoring was being carried out, DebugNS was used to examine RingSim for potential bugs. The experiments were carried out on a variety of square grid arrays, but the pictures in this presentation use 5x5 grids for clarity. The overriding hypothesis to test was that the behavior of rings would fall into one of a number of classes given by the local topography. This led to novelty search searching over different inputs to the ring system, with the outputs being the relative classes of each ring, as determined by metrics from the ring system and clustering. The expected behaviors that were tested were that the number of ring classes was much smaller than the total number of rings, and that the allocation of ring classes was mirror and rotationally symmetric. That is, a reverse magnetic field did not affect ring class, and that rings in mirror and rotationally symmetric positions had the same class. As can be seen, the ring classes that were typically found in RingSim v1 did not meet this hypothesis. Each corner and edge belongs to a different class. While in terms of metrics the classes are very similar, they are sufficiently distinct to be flagged by DebugNS. Using the individuals found by DebugNS, it was possible to find multiple bugs in RingSim. The first two of these, that domain rules could pass through each other rather than annihilating, and the assumption that the driving magnetic field would always be clockwise, were simply due to DebugNS pushing RingSim with inputs that it hadn't been designed to handle, even if they were technically valid. The final bug was more subtle. Due to RingSim v1 updating rings from top to bottom, left to right, the behavior at the edges was slightly different depending on the edge. These findings were used to inform development of RingSim v2 and make sure that these classes of bug could not occur. And, as can be seen, when applying DebugNS to RingSim v2, the ring classes are rotationally and mirror symmetric, meaning that the hypothesis now holds. To conclude, Novelty search can be combined with appropriate metrics to create a debugging tool. As a benefit, there is natural reuse of code if the system being tested was going to be used with Novelty search anyway. While it may be most powerful if there is a trusted oracle to compare results against, it's also useful to get a population of varied individuals for checking that hypothesis holds. In the future, we want to investigate using Novelty search to automatically test equivalence between two systems, in particular attempting to evaluate if two physical experimental setups are equivalent. Any questions?